Welcome to the Clean Library Podcast, where content meets conscience. We believe there are millions of you readers out there desperately searching for a better way to find clean content. Each episode, we will introduce you to a new author of clean books, giving you, your family, and your friends clean options.
Hello, my name is Marcus Williams. Welcome to the Clean Library Podcast. Today we have special guest BJ Salmond. Welcome. He, in his own words, I'm a native of Utah. My beautiful wife Stacy and I are raising 6 awesome kids in American Fork. I love American history, LDS church history, family history, good old-fashioned rock and roll from the 50s to the 80s, and the time-honored game of chess. I received my MBA from the University of Phoenix, a BA from Southern Utah University, and 2 Associate of Applied Sciences degrees from the Community College of the Air Force. Welcome, BJ. Thanks for being on the show with us today.
Thank you.
So before we jump into it and get to know you and your books, we're going to read your 2 Truths and a Lie and see if I can work those into the conversation today to try to figure out which one is the lie. So number 1, I have a mom who was born deaf but learned to read lips rather than sign by putting her hand on the throat of her teacher, and that is how she learned the sounds. Number 2, when I was trying to light a water heater, I let the gas run too long. When I lit the match, I saw the fire rushing towards me, so I looked down, and my hair got all burned up and has not grown back. That's how I became bald. And number 3, while I was loading a truck, I fell backward from a vehicle bed that was 5 feet off the ground and landed with a parkour-type roll without a break, bruise, or a scratch. All right. Well, I don't know how I'm going to weave those into the conversation, but we'll see what happens today. So, BJ, why don't you just start and tell us about your book? Introduce us to what you've written.
Okay, so it's a historical fiction, and the reason I wrote the book is because I was doing some research on my wife's side, and I was building these picture charts, and it was a 5-generation picture chart with all the kids at the bottom, and then I went 5 generations up. I got to this one chart where I had all but one picture, and I'm like, man, I got to find that picture, and so I started doing a lot of research. And I couldn't find the picture, and I finally, in all the research I was doing, I found all these stories about this person, and they were incredible stories. And I was like, man, this would make a good movie. And my wife's like, any good movie starts with a good book. I'm like, you're right. And so I started writing, and so I eventually did find the picture, but the story that I started reading about, I kind of fictionalized a little bit. I put her grandparents as fictional characters in the first half of the book, and the last little bit of the book is their actual experience. And so, but yeah, it starts in St. Louis, Missouri, where the main character, he's having struggles with anger, and so he actually gets exiled from the state because of some of his anger issues, and the place that he goes to is Illinois, where he meets Abraham Lincoln. He meets the girl he's going to marry, and what's interesting is I just kind of put him in these situations in history and let history play itself out. And it was kind of fun to write because there were a lot of historical things that happened during that time in those places. And so we get him into a love story with how he met his wife and how they started falling in love. And I actually wanted to stay true to history. So I looked up the date they got married. They actually got married, probably about when in their 30s. But most people get married in their 20s, right? So
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh, great. I've got them met, and I've got them courting, and I've got to figure out how to break them up until they actually get married. And so I'm like, well, there's got to be a war sometime in this time period. And after scouring all the wars, I found one, and it was perfect because there was a Seminole Indian War that happened in Florida, and it just so happened that a group of Missourians um, left from Missouri to go support the Seminole Indian War. And it's like, great, I'll just get him back into Missouri somehow because he's been exiled, and
Right.
And then get him into that regiment to join the group. And so I kind of break up the love story. She falls in love with another man while he's away on a trip, and she's going to marry him when he gets back. He finds out, and he's heartbroken, and so he's like, and his business starts failing, and so he's like, I'll just go back to my parents. I'll sneak back into the state. He reads about the Alamo, and he's like, okay, that inspires him to join the military, and so he goes in the military. Meanwhile, she finds out that the guy that she wanted to marry was a real jerk, and she tries to find him. She can't find him, so she goes to the postmaster and gets the address and goes back to finds his home, his parents. She's like, oh, he's left for the war, and so she's like, oh, well, okay, but they kind of hire her on as a maid to work for them until he gets back, and so he goes off to war, and the main turning point of the book. So he has some things happen on this journey, because the regiment that he joined with, they actually had a huge struggle getting to Florida, and he experiences the struggle with them. Like, they experience passing through cities that have a cholera outbreak. They lose a whole bunch of people. They go get on these boats with all their horses. This is a regiment of cavalry, and so
Okay.
they load all their horses onto these boats, and they the on their way to Florida, the boats get tossed and shaken up in the sea, because there's this huge storm that comes through, and by the time they get to Florida, um, a lot of the horses are dead, and a lot of the horses are injured, and so they got to go through and start killing the injured horses. And his horse that his dad gave him is one of those horses, and he's on the group on the crew that is going through killing his horses, and he sees his horse. He can't bring himself to do it, and he has this moment where he starts thinking, well, maybe I can help fix the leg or something to bring it back, and one of the sailors comes up and shoots the horse, and as soon as he does that, he just loses it and starts attacking the sailor. And he's about to shoot the sailor, and then someone tackles him, and he realizes, oh no, I almost killed someone. I really do have a problem with my anger. And then as he goes into the Indian War, he has this experience that's a turning point for him, where he's a scout. He's waiting for, just kind of scouting out for other Indian scouts that might be coming through looking for places to attack. And so he sees this Indian walk by, and he stands up and he shoots him. And he's got this real grudge against Indians, because before and during the war, they kill his two best friends real maliciously. And so he's got this huge grudge against the Indians. He really wants to get back at them. And so he jumps up and he shoots this Indian. And as he goes up to finish him off, the Indian looks him in the eye and says, "What's your name?" And he's like, "What? You speak English?" And he's kind of shocked for a little bit. He's like, "What do you mean?" And then the Indian's like, "I would like to know your name." And he says, "My name's William." And the Indian says, "William, I just want you to know that I forgive you." And this takes him back. And so he's like, "What?" And so they have this little conversation together where he finds out that the Indian had converted to Christianity. And then the Indian's talking to him. He says, well, "I just want you to know that when it's your turn to come, I'll be waiting for you on the other side." And this changes him in such a way that he now feels bad that he shot the Indian. And they have this conversation, and then the Indian finally dies while they're talking, and so he starts to want to bury him, but then he starts getting attacked by these other Indians that are following up, and so he flees, and this is like a turning point in the book for him. Like, he all the prejudice and anger that he had just kind of melts away, and he spends the rest of the book trying to figure out how to make that melting away permanent, and he eventually figures it out in the end, and there's a great climax where he finally was able to overcome, and so
Cool.
yeah.
So, how obviously you had to add a lot, and so how did you build these characters just with the source material, which I assume was fairly limited?
Yeah.
Um, how did you go about doing that and building their characteristics and personalities and stuff?
So a lot of it just kind of came to me, and a lot of the characters were supplied, like they're historical figures that I could research, and like Abraham Lincoln was there.
Hmm.
Porter Rockwell was part of it. He got captured in St. Louis, and so he's part of the story. He actually saves the main character, and that's how he gets on his track to conversion into the gospel. Is he tries to save because Porter Rockwell saves his life, he tries to save Porter Rockwell's life, and so he but Porter Rockwell's like, no, don't try and save my life because I'm innocent. All I really need from you right now is a Book of Mormon. And he's like, what? And he's like, a Book of Mormon. Go find Book of Mormon, and that's all I need. And so he goes to find a Book of Mormon. He can't find it. And by the time he goes back to ask like where he could get one, Porter Rockwell's been transferred. And so he spends he spends his time every time he goes somewhere. He looks for this Book of Mormon that he can't find. And finally, when some missionaries walk into his store, they present him one. And he's like, well, how much does that cost? And he wants to know, and so but the characters, a lot of the characters, I'd say probably about 75%, 80% of the characters were actually in history. Um,
Okay.
and so I just kind of studied those characters. I just put them in history. A big portion of the book, because eventually he does go back to St. Louis after his exile is over, and he raises his family there. But what's interesting about St. Louis, because it says in his story that he went from Missouri and he started from Missouri and went to Utah. And I'm like, well, how could have he gone from Missouri to Utah? Because they had the extermination order in Missouri.
Yeah.
And come to find out, there's a group of saints in St. Louis from the time that Parley P. Pratt, um, he's called to serve a mission to the Lamanites, right? Well, he stops in St. Louis and converts a bunch of people, and then keeps going. And those people he converts start growing a branch, and that branch turns into a stake. And the stake is there throughout the entire history of the church. The people of St. Louis thought the extermination order was an idiot's dream. They didn't think that they should be, against any religious body at all. And so the saints were allowed to grow and flourish in St. Louis throughout the whole history of the church, even when the saints were being driven from Missouri and stuff. And so you've got this rich history of saints in St. Louis that, like I said in my bio, I love church history. And I've read a lot of church history, as much as I can find, because I just like to soak it in. I have
Yeah.
not read about this group of people. And when I started researching them, I found out so much about them that I'm like, this needs to be part of my book because this story has not been told. And so my main characters experience the story of the St. Louis Saints, and it's an incredible story.
Interesting. And that just that whole story, and for people listening who may not be familiar as much with the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it's a very American story. I think whether you're a member of that church, whether you know about that church, it's a very just American story of religious freedom, hardship, overcoming it, the migration. Like it's kind of the epitome of the American story, I think.
Yeah.
So that's cool. So was his exile from Missouri, is that a true part of that, or
No,
was that
no,
okay?
that was me trying to figure out an inciting incident.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
So
Um, so are you like a lot of times I know with me, once you start developing and creating these characters that kind of come to life, so are there more stories out there with that you are going to write?
So yeah, the story of uh, and I won't give away the ending, but the story that I tell that actually happens to them, we get to that point in the story, and the continuation of that story is what happens to the kids, um, uh, you know, after the end of the book. And so the story, I'm in the middle of I'm still writing book two. It's supposed to be a trilogy, and book two is about his daughter, who you see throughout. She's born in the book, and she goes with him throughout the story. But I start the book off with her actually telling the story of her father to her son, who has anger issues, and she's trying to teach him how her father overcame these anger issues. And they, the story of the Princess Bride, where they kind of have the grandpa and the grandchild, and they kind of pop into the story every now and then.
Yeah.
She does that with her son, and they kind of pop into the story every now and then, and he's like, "What? What's going on here?" And by the end, the son's like, "Oh, okay, I can see why I should be overcoming my anger. I'm going to try and stop." And
Yeah.
so their story is book two. She has an incredible story. She goes, "Is it okay if I tell that story?"
Sure. Yeah.
She has a so she goes to she ends up in southern Utah and meeting a boy or a man, I guess, who she ends up marrying by the name of Jefferson Slade. And none of this is made up. This is all true story.
Okay.
So she marries a man named Jefferson Slade. She's 15 and he's 25, I think. And they get married, and Jefferson Slade says, "I want to do polygamy," and she's like, "No, I'm not doing polygamy."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Well, I want to, and if you don't like it, you can leave." And she's like, "Fine, I'm leaving." And so she leaves, and when she gets to Riverton, Utah, she finds out that she's pregnant. And she goes back to southern Utah and finds Jefferson Slade and she says, "I want to get back together." He's like, "You left me, I don't have anything to do with you." So she leaves him and doesn't tell him that she's pregnant.
Wow.
And so she names the son Jefferson. Her last name is Chestnut.
Okay.
And so she names the son, his name is Jefferson Slade. She names the son Jefferson Chestnut Slade. And he grows up thinking that he's illegitimate and he's, that he doesn't have a father, because she won't ever talk about the father. And she will, she'll marry a man, and I can't remember his name right now, but she marries a man who has a family already with 8 children, but he doesn't tell her about the other family. And this is the reason she left the first husband, right?
Oh,
And
man.
so 2 years after they get married, she finds out that he's married, and she leaves him. She's like, "No, I didn't want that in the first place." So she leaves him.
Right.
She marries another guy who she has 2 children with, but after the second child's born, he dies. And then she finally marries the last one, whose name is Eugene. Oh shoot, the last name is, but his name is Eugene, and he loves her, and she loves him, and that's who she stays with. But he does not like Jefferson Chestnut Slade in the tiniest, and he treats him very poorly, and he'll make him eat out on the porch, and won't let him eat at the table. He said in his journal, he said he was treated like a dog, and I'm sure he probably had things that he did that ticked off. It was probably
Yeah.
it. But he ends up running away from home at age 11 and going to work in a bar in Logan, Utah, and he's doing all the grunge work. He's cleaning the spittoons, cleaning the latrines, cleaning up the mess that people leave, and he ends up hating cigarette smoke and liquor because of this experience. When he grows up, if he sees anyone smoking around, he'll pull the cigarette out of their mouth and throw it on the ground. And so he ends up, after that, he goes to work for the railroad, and while he's worked there, so you know who William Cody is?
Yeah.
Buffalo Bill, right?
Buffalo Bill. Yeah.
Yeah, and so William Cody founded Cody, Wyoming, and
Right.
he commissioned a railroad line to be built when they were building the Transcontinental Railroad. He commissioned the line that goes from the Transcontinental Railroad to Cody, Wyoming, and Jefferson Slade ends up working on, or Jefferson Chestnut Slade ends up working on that line, and he's working with all these Chinese guys that are working on the line, and William Cody sees this American boy working with all the Chinese adults, and he's like, "What's this?" And so he takes him in. He teaches him how to shoot, how to ride. he teaches them about business, and they become great friends, and he'll end up trying a lot of businesses, but one that sticks with him is a trading business that he becomes really rich off of doing. And one of the guys that he does business with will go to Southern Utah and meet his dad and say, "I just did business with someone who looks just like you and has your exact same name."
That's your name.
Yeah, and the guy will be like, "Well, wow, that's news to me." And so they start writing to each other, and he's excited because he didn't know he had a father, and
My father, yeah.
that he was born in a marriage, so he wasn't illegitimate, right? And so he sends a wagon down to Southern Utah, picks up his dad. He builds a stage in the middle of town, invites the entire town to this huge party. When his dad gets there, he invites them up on stage and says, "Everyone, this was my father. I told you I weren't no bastard." And that'll be book 3. So book 2 will be about her and her marriages, and book 3 will be about him and his running away and meeting his father. And so
That, wow, that must have been just fascinating diving into all of that history and
yeah.
everything. Um, were you able to find journals and primary sources, and how did you do all that research?
So I did a lot of online searching. There was a lot of newspapers of the day that I was able to get through. There's a website I found that kept the newspapers of the day, and I used a lot of those.
Mm-hmm.
There was because one of the main features of the true story is that they bought a big fancy wagon, and they took this wagon with them, and they had hired 2 teamsters and they were really rich, and so I had to tell the story of how they got rich, right? And so that was all part
Yeah.
of the story. And so they bought this big fancy wagon. And part of the story I was researching, I'm like, well, where would he buy a wagon in Missouri? And so I started researching wagon shops that were open in Missouri during that time.
Yeah.
And I found one in Independence, Missouri, run by a man by the name of Hiram Young. Let's see. Yeah, Hiram Young was his name.
Mm-hmm.
Hiram Young was a black man who ran the wagon shop, and he was a slave owner. And this was, when I read about this, I was super shocked because I didn't know there were black slave owners. And
Mm-hmm.
so I have my character buy his wagon from this Hiram Young, and he's really prejudiced against Mormons too because he's living in Independence, Missouri. And so there's a whole interaction here, and he gets his wagon through trickery, and because Hiram doesn't want to sell to him because he's Mormon.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's characters that I kept finding in history that I'm like, this person has to be in my book, and so I arrange a meeting with them, just like when Joseph Smith dies, I have him go to Nauvoo and he meets Emma, and he meets Buffalo Bill's dad, um, and his name's Isaac Cody. I never,
Mm-hmm.
you don't, unless you know who he is, you don't really know that he's Buffalo Bill's dad. But
Yeah.
the name of the main character is William Chestnut, right? And
Yeah.
so I have William Chestnut save Isaac Cody's life 3 different times, and as a result, Isaac Cody is going to name his son William Cody. So, and that's fiction, but it's a good story, and
Right.
so
Right.
um,
Just connecting little historical characters
yeah,
together and bringing
yeah.
them to life. That's cool.
Yeah, because William Cody is going to be a major part of book 3, right? So,
Right.
in the life of Jefferson Chestnut Slade. So,
So did you ever think that you were going to be an author with a trilogy? Was that in
I
your life plans?
no, I actually never did think that, and I never had an aspiration to write any books until I came across this story, and I just thought it was a story that needed to be told. And one of the main motivators is as I started telling the story of this family to my wife's parents and her aunts and uncles, nobody knew the story. I'm like, how could a story like this be forgotten? And
Yeah.
so I'm like, this story needs to be known and never forgotten. And so I started, you know, I'm like, this needs to be known forever. And so I wrote the book, and hopefully I can get the other 2 books written too and get those stories out.
Yeah. And I mean, kind of the thing that hits me as you're telling the story is just how human it is. Sure, the times were different, the year were different, maybe beliefs and expectations and technologies, but the human experience is like we can learn from it today because it's the same.
Yeah.
When, you know, struggles with family members and love and anger, like all that stuff is just very relevant and human. And when we don't study it and we don't remember, then we have to learn those lessons the hard way. We have to learn them all over again. Yeah, and it's also inspiring. I have a it's a pretty well known story. My third great grandmother, I believe, she was in the Martin and Willie Handcart Company, and her husband died one night next to her, but it was so cold she had to just lie there all night next to her husband who passed away, and then try to bury him in the morning and continue on this trek because they're out in the middle of nowhere. They can't
Yeah.
just stop and you know. And I always think if she could do that, and she ended up living a very long, fulfilling life and had kids and grandkids, and I mean, I'm descended from her. If she could do that, like I can do whatever hard thing is happening to me today, you
Yeah.
know. So that's I think it's really important and something that, and that's the power of family history. Like I love that you started with this looking for a photo, and then now you've gone down this long path of studying that whole history, and that's what family history does to you. Once you start, it's like you feel that connection. You just can't stop.
Yeah.
That's very cool. So did you end up traditionally publishing, or are you indie published?
So I did a lot of research on that. And mind you, I'd never written a book before. I do have an English minor in my degree,
Hmm.
but I'd never written a book before, and so I didn't really know how to write a book or even the art of story. And
Yeah.
so I did a lot of research on traditional publishing and self publishing, and I actually found this place called what do they call them? I think they call themselves self publishing com. I think, but it's a school on how to self publish,
Yeah.
and and I thought, okay, well, I'll join this school and they'll teach me how to self publish. And I found out, there's you can go with the traditional publisher, but and the thing that swayed me towards self publishing was that even if you go with a traditional publisher, you still have to do all the work to sell your book.
Right.
You don't. I mean, the publisher helps you very little like maybe in the very beginning they help you to get the
Yeah.
initial copies out, but after that they just stop, and it's up to you. And I'm like, well, if it's up to me anyway, and I'll get more royalties of self publishing, why not just self publish? And so I just decided to go that route. And the school that I went through, I was surprised because they didn't only teach me how to self publish, but they taught me the art of story. Like they taught me like a story has these elements, and you have to hit every one of these elements to make it an effective story. And
Right.
they're like these are things I never knew, and so I started studying the art of story and all the elements of story, all the elements of an effective, not only of an effective story, but also of an effective scene. How do you write an effective scene so that it's engaging, and that every scene is engaging, so that people want to keep reading and going through. And those are things that I learned at this self publishing school that helped me write the book, to be an engaging book to read. And a lot of reviews that I've seen online about my book were they just didn't want to put it down. They just wanted to keep reading it because the scenes are kind of move you through it. So
Yeah. And but the downside to that is now whenever you read someone else's story or watch a movie, you know what's wrong with
yeah.
it. They forgot that. They forgot this.
Yeah, interesting enough, a lot of the like really famous stories, once you learn the story structure, you start to see it in every movie you start watching.
Hmm.
In Harry Potter, in any of the Disney movies, you start to see it's like, oh, there's that element, yep, and there's that element, and now they're gonna hit that element. Okay, now they've got the climax, and now we're done. So you can just start to see all the elements as you go through, and you start watching movies in a different way. Well, especially if you're watching for the second time. The first time you're just kind of enjoying it. The second time you're like,
Right.
okay, you're dissecting it more, and
Right. It's
So
kind of like when if you watch a movie that has to do with your profession or something that you're expert at, and you're trying not to judge it the entire time.
yeah.
So, how do you market, since that is, no matter which way you publish, self-marketing is a huge part of getting your book out there. What?
Yeah, and for me, that was the most challenging thing that I had to face, even harder than writing the book. Well,
Mhm.
and because I didn't know what to do, I took there was courses for how to market through Amazon, and I took those, and they were successful. Successful. They you know made money for like a week, and then they
Yeah.
stopped. And I couldn't figure out the marketing aspect of it. And they told the people at the school told me to stay away from Facebook advertising because you'll just lose money, and so I did. But Amazon wasn't, it wasn't helping me. Their keyword
Yeah.
searching that they do was just, and everyone I talked to would say, well, it should be making you money. I'm like, well, it's not. And so I don't know what to, I didn't know what to do. And so and I tried to actually pay people to look at my things, but they didn't really help that much. And so looking at my advertisements, and so I just never got any really good help with how to do that effectively. And so I'm like, I'm just going to look at Facebook ads because that's the only thing I haven't tried yet. And so
Yeah.
I did the advertising websites. I mean, and those were great. Those advertising websites were great. And this, I guess, I'll tell you the story of how I got into Facebook. So um, I started paying these companies to advertise for me, and I was paying them. I felt like a lot of money, and they would get me um, revenue, but not enough.
Yeah.
And one in particular would get me a lot of revenue, but it was just barely breaking even. And I found out how they were advertising. They were advertising through Facebook ads. And I said, well, if they can do that good through Facebook ads, I wonder what I can do. And so I started jumping into Facebook ads. And so what I started out with Facebook ads is I did just a general kind of a blast out to a bunch of people. I kind of used some of the criteria, but I made it as general as I could, so I could get the broadest audience that I could. And
Yeah.
Facebook ads has it has data on the people that buy your stuff, and it reports that data to you. And so I was starting to look at who was buying my book, and I was like, oh, who knew? And so I found out the demographic of people who are buying my book. I did a Facebook ad targeting that demographic, and that ad has been making me money ever since I ran it. I started running it. So it you know I spend probably about $90 a month in Facebook advertising, and I make probably about 130. So I don't make a ton, but
Yeah.
it's not losing money, which is what I was doing before that. So it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah. And if you look at the percentage of royalties you get and everything, that's really good. Like, not many authors with unknown authors can hit that starting out. So um, you're doing much better than a lot of people that we've talked to, which is great. Um, and I I've tried different methods as well. I've done some Facebook ads, and they got me a little bit. But it's it's definitely an entire process. It's an entirely new thing you have to learn how to
Mhm.
do and what to do. And there's so many people out there that want to take your money
Yeah,
and promise you results, and then you get nothing. And it's never their fault that their work doesn't pay off. It's always, oh well, people just don't want your book.
yeah. Right.
So that's a hard nut to crack. So
Yeah,
congratulations that you being successful and working there. That's great.
yeah.
If you since you didn't plan to grow up to write books and be an author, is there something that you've learned that you would tell your present self would tell your past self?
So the self publishing school was very expensive, and I don't know if I'll ever make my money back from what I spent on it.
Yeah.
But to me, it was worth it because they taught me invaluable things that I never would have learned on my own, and things that I've put in a PowerPoint, and anyone I meet that is writing a book, I send them. This is how you write an effective story. This is the story structure. This is the scene structure. And if you want to make your book, sellable, you need to follow these structures. And usually what you do is you write the rough draft, and then you go back and see if it matches those structures. And if it doesn't, you edit to make it match those structures.
Yeah.
So that was the most valuable thing to me was getting that. And I'll give that information out to for free to anybody who asks it for me, because I don't think anyone should have to pay as much as I did to get it. But it was super valuable for me to get it, because I wouldn't have written the book as effectively as I did had I not,
Yeah.
had that tutelage.
That's cool. So as far as, since clean is one of our big topics, clearly with the arc of your character from the anger issues and through his conversion and everything, you could have easily used a lot of language and violence and stuff in the beginning to make that arc a little more dramatic. Is there a reason why you chose to keep the entire book clean? How did
Well,
that
I
work
found
for
it
you?
pretty easy because, and I actually looked up swear words that they used in those days,
Yeah.
and they're words to us that are silliness. And so when you hear them used, you're like, "That's funny."
Right.
Like one of them is that guy's a rat bag. To us that sounds kind of silly, but to them it was very offensive. And
Yeah.
so there's phrases like that are used, but yeah, it is kind of meant for. The funny thing about my book is I meant it for an LDS audience,
Okay.
because the first half of the book doesn't really have much LDS stuff in it, but it's him and his wife meeting, and it's him figuring out his anger issues and in that turning point that we talked about. And that's
Right.
the first half of the book. The second half of the book is his conversion story, his baptism story, which by the way is a very interesting story, which actually happened to another ancestor. What if I may diverge just for a minute? What happens is he meets the missionaries and starts getting taught, but him and his wife decide they don't like Mormons, so he starts hiding the fact that he's being taught from his wife, and and so he's sneaking out and getting taught and reading the Book of Mormon. He keeps the Book of Mormon out in the shed, and finally he reads it and he's like, "Oh, this is true," and without thinking about it, he brings it into the house with him, and his wife is like, "What do you got there?" And he's like, "Oh crap!" And he's like, "Well, those Mormons, they just pushed this on me, so I just took it so they'd leave me alone." He's like, "Here, you get rid of it," and so he hands it to her and walks up the stairs, and she takes it and she hides it, and she starts reading it, and and she goes sneaking out of the house, getting taught by the missionaries, and of course the missionaries know that they're both doing this, and so they plan their baptism for the same day. And so he sneaks out of the house on that day, with an extra pair of clothes, and she sneaks out of the house on that day with an extra pair of clothes, and they meet up at the baptism. She taps him on the shoulder and says, and she finds out, he turns around and it's like, "Oh," and she's like, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "Getting baptized." "What are you doing here?" "Getting baptized." And I'm like, "Oh." And so that's a true story. It didn't happen to them, but it happened to another set of ancestors that I just had to use
That's
this
funny.
story. But where was I going before that?
Just talking about keeping it clean
Oh,
and
yes.
your audience.
And so it was meant for an LDS audience, and so I didn't want to put anything in. I mean, there were murders and things that happened in the book,
Yeah.
but if you read some of the reviews, they say, yeah, that stuff's in there, but it's done tastefully. And so um, yeah, I just I didn't want to turn off my main audience, and so I tried to keep it as clean as I possibly could. And what's funny about that is the majority of people who are reading it aren't LDS. There's uh, there are some LDS people reading it, but a lot of them haven't been, and they're like, "This is a great book," and I'm hoping that like some of the comments I've gotten from people that have talked to me, and even in one of the comments online was that it inspired them to want to read their Book of Mormon more. And I'm hoping that's the
Interesting.
case for anyone who reads it, that they'll, want to draw closer to the Savior as a result of reading that story, and they'll want to, read their Book of Mormon more, and get, develop
Yeah.
their relationship with the Savior because they read that story, and that hopefully will inspire them to want to move closer to the Savior. So
Yeah. And that's a ringing endorsement, I think, of making the decision to keep it clean and tasteful. Um, you're inspiring something in people that you probably wouldn't be able to do otherwise if you hadn't, which is very cool. And that's interesting. You've got all that Facebook data now that you can see who's reading it and who's not. And
yeah,
yeah, sometimes that's the way it works. Your audience isn't who you planned on
yeah,
at the beginning, but that's
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 who's
the way
buying
it
it.
goes.
That's who you sell to.
Exactly. Very cool. Uh, well, we're running out of time here. So are there any other authors that write clean books that you would recommend to our listeners?
So I'm a huge fan of historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite historical fictions is, because I love American history too, Ron Wilkie wrote Prelude to Glory, which is a historical fiction about the Revolutionary War. It is wonderful. It just takes you through the whole Revolutionary War in an entertaining way, and you get to
Cool.
experience that richness of history through his books. So,
Very cool. Awesome.
yeah.
Well, let's review your Two Truths and a Lie. And we didn't talk about gas explosion or anything, but so I'll take a stab at it. So number one, I have a mom who was born deaf but learned to read lips rather than sign by putting her hand on the throat of her teacher, and that is how she learned the sounds. Number two, when I was trying to light a water heater, I let the gas run too long. When I lit the match, I saw the fire rushing toward me, so I looked down and my hair got all burned up and has not grown back. And number three, while I was loading a truck, I fell backward from a vehicle bed that was 5 feet off the ground and landed with a parkour type roll without break, bruise, or scratch. Well, nothing we talked about is helping me on this one, so I failed in that respect. Now, it wasn't a water heater, it was a furnace, but I had a very similar experience and got some pretty bad burns on my hand on an old furnace. So that's whether or not that would burn all your hair so it wouldn't grow back, who knows? So I'm just going to go for it. I'll say that one is the lie. Number
That
two.
is the lie.
All right.
It's actually a
Uh,
partial lie. I did have that experience, but it didn't burn all my hair off.
so the great thing about me getting it right is that without Brock here to compete with, I was behind, so I'm catching up to you. This is Steve, our
Oh,
scorekeeper.
nice.
So
Nice.
excellent. Well, BJ, thank you so much for being with us today and for talking about your books and your story. I hope that our listeners are inspired to go out and to read your book, but also to dive into their own family history and learn the story of their ancestors and the people that came before them. It's going to be very, very inspiring and helpful for us today. So thank you so much. And all of you out there listening, please subscribe and share and let other people know about the podcast. The best thing you can do to help us grow is by sharing and word of mouth. So really appreciate it, and we'll catch you next time on the Clean Library Podcast.
Thank you.